Democrats in schools call for another reinstatement of vaccine and mask mandates. Another House scare of Mitch McConnell leads to talks over instituting a cognitive and age test. That and much, much more in the Politically Tolerant. My name is Zach and Cooper.
And I'm Cooper Brown.
If you like us, make sure to hit that subscribe button and make sure to give us a thumbs up.
So the Democrats seem to be back at it again here, where they have now pushing again for schools to implement vaccine or mask mandates, and they're pushing for Americans to get their yearly booster shots as COVID starts to rise, I guess. But in my eyes, this seems to be a little bit more indicative that next year's election season, and so you might want to drum up a little fear in the hearts of the people and start pushing old school narratives like the good old fashioned COVID-19.
Yeah, but man, how often do they have to push that to understand that's going to be effective anymore? I mean, we look at it; it's like a COVID. Let's say they call it the COVID, a new COVID variant. It's like when we're talking about the flu, let's say 10 years ago, it's not like we're going to talk about, oh, another flu happened, so let's lock up everyone in their homes and make sure they don't have any freedom. No,
Mm-hmm.
we went through it as a normal instance. We can't ignore the fact that there is another variant. We have to get to things the way there has to be in order to function as a society. And you're talking about the fact that another election is taking place. The primary elections are taking place. That could be a factor, the reason why. I mean, also another factor is the fact that who's benefiting from these lockdowns. You could say, well, the government's having control over what the people think. That's also very positive for the Democrats, especially. But we could talk about the fact that the people who are manufacturing these vaccines, if they're continually requiring boosters to people, and the government's mandating these boosters, who's actually benefiting? It's these pharmaceutical companies and people in government who are getting lobbyist money from them. I mean, that's just evident. I mean, we've given I don't know how many $billions to Pfizer and Moderna for the vaccines. So that is also an instance why they would want to push it.
I mean, you've been watching a lot of RFK Jr. I can tell because you're really hating on on vaccine corporations. No, actually, I agree with basically whatever you're saying because it is true that we do give these companies huge amounts of business, and they did make billions, maybe trillions of dollars on the whole COVID-19 pandemic. I don't think that is necessarily the case in this instance, though, is that they're just motivated on purely providing more profits to these pharmaceutical companies. I think it's mostly about the fact that Democrats are just trying to play up any card they can. They knew that COVID 19 and getting people to stay home and implement a lot of mail in ballots and then change the election laws of various states was very effective in driving turnout for Democrats. And I know the press secretary was, of the White House of Joe Biden was pushing for the idea that people get more boosters. And we have a clip here of Joe Biden talking to various reporters saying that he was trying to push for legislation that would include increasing the ability to produce more vaccines, produce more boosters, and possibly come up with an effective one, I guess, because I mean all the other vaccines weren't effective, but now this new one that we're going to spend a bunch of money towards, that's going to be the true effective one.
Can you say anything about the uptick of COVID cases and the new variant?
Yes, I can. Matter of fact, I signed off this morning on a proposal we have to present to the Congress a request for additional funding for new vaccine that is necessary, that works. And tentatively, not decided finally yet, tentatively it is recommended that, it would likely be recommended that everybody get it, no matter whether they got it before.
There's just one thing from that. I mean, we see especially that Joe Biden is a Democrat president. So who's drumming up all this fear? I mean, we could talk about, in the previous COVID pandemic, there were Republicans, Democrats that were unanimously supporting the mandates and so forth for the lockdowns. But now we see what's actually taking place. We see it's mainly Democrats in schools and that are more liberal leaning that are leading to these lockdowns and mandates. So then we have to argue, yes, if we're talking about the election, that this will affect the election, people going to trying to institute back the mail voting mandates. We're seeing what the Democrats are trying to do with Trump and trying to remove the possibility of him being elected. So all of this combined together, it does appear to be that this is a focal point with the Democrats trying to remove a possibility of a free and fair election. So I would argue that.
I mean, and I don't think it's necessarily just the federal government that's pushing these things, because we're seeing corporations, we're seeing schools, various schools like the Morris Brown College, which is in Atlanta, them pushing for vaccine mandates, and they came out with actually this very funny memo here. And I want you to see if you can kind of spot the similarity here, where at the bottom it says, over the next 14 days, these following processes will be in place, being social distancing, mask mandates or mask wearing, the removal of large gatherings, indoor venues and activities. But that line where they say 14 days sounds very similar to 2 weeks to slow the spread. So they're not even changing their tune here anymore. They're just saying the exact same thing as they said 3 years ago, and just bringing up the exact same old playbook that they've used, that was effective for them back in 2020. But it's not just this school. There's another junior high school called Kimbersh, I believe. Their junior high school, they also implemented mask mandates, and then even Lionsgate, the big studio, the Hollywood studio that produces movies, they've also implemented mask mandates in their productions again. So slowly we're seeing corporations and schools starting to warm up to this idea of reinstituting the really terrible measures that everyone wants to forget about during 2020, 2021, during the COVID era, if you want to call it. And I don't see this sticking very well with the American people. We are so sick and tired of COVID. We're so sick and tired of masks. I think it's a foolish endeavor to try and push this again on the American people, because I think it'll only end in a bigger backlash against the Democrats, against these school boards or administrations that are pushing this idea of remasking our children again, after all we've learned about the terrible instances that schools has caused, being them having children ripped away from classrooms, and then the social problems that occur when you just force children to wear masks all day. Like, this is not going to stick well, I think, with the American public.
I mean, I agree, and it is quite frustrating to see that they're pushing this again, that how they're weaponized against the American people. Now, I mean, we're not going to argue. We are more right-leaning in terms of a lot of our ideas, and in terms of what we support politically. But what I'm trying to argue here is that how there's so much uniformity within, we could argue, the leftist ideology, whether it has to do with vaccines, whether it has to do with a race, whether it has to do with transgender ideology, that you could easily pursue this, and that who's going to be cooperative? Businesses are going to be cooperative. Who else? Schools, right? The government institutes some kind of warning with boosters. Everyone's going to start cooperating together within this ideology. And that's what's troubling, because that is honestly an un-American thing to do, that you could just impose this on the people, on everyone, institute this on the American people. And I think that's what's wrong with this new ideology. I don't think it's only vaccines, as it is as an encompassing ideology, what, let's say, the left represents nowadays.
I think you're totally wrong. I don't think you're giving the American people enough respect in this regards, because just because it happened one time in 2020 where, granted, there was a lot of fear and unknown about COVID, and so a lot of people were willing to go along with kind of this COVID narrative. The school, Morris Brown College, is in Atlanta, and so that's not a particularly Republican city. It's a very left, Democrat-controlled city, and so they're willing. So the places controlled by liberals, they're much more warm to the fact of embracing these ideas, because they're the ones that actually feared COVID the most. Most American people, if the federal government institutes a mandate on them, that very nature, Americans have this spirit about them that if you tell them what to do, they'll do the opposite just because of spite. And that's one of the great things about Americans, and that most countries don't understand, and that's probably why they don't like us as much, is that we do not take well and do not take kindly to people telling us what to do, especially from the federal government, people that are supposed to be working for us. So I disagree with you on the fact that them drumming up this fear again, that they'll just be vast swaths of people that just naturally go along with it.
Well, I mean, look, if we look at this, is just a human nature aspect point. Now, I'm not arguing that there are resistance within a lot of Americans towards these mandates to start with 3 years ago, but you could drum up fear amongst the people. I don't think this is actually. I don't argue this is going to work this time. But as we say, 3 years ago, something as unknown as COVID, to bring that kind of fear to the people will oblige for their own safety of themselves and their family members, even over their security and freedom. Now, I argue that as a universal trait. I know people throughout afterwards started to awaken to the idea of the mandates being wrong. But you say to start with 3 years ago, most people complied with these measures. Everything was in lockdown. Cities were on lockdown. States were on lockdown. Now, I know you're going to bring up Ron DeSantis in Florida. I know that. But I argue for the majority, the most part, in America, people complied, Democrats, Republicans. Now, that's why I say why COVID, we have to learn from that. But the fact that they're bringing up again is the reason why what I argue is this uniformity. Now, I'm not saying within Republican Democrats. I'm saying this is mostly within the left, okay? Because I wouldn't want to include Republicans in this situation because it sure at least seems like now it's mainly Democrats supporting this agenda. What I'm saying is that whether it has to do with COVID-19, whether it has to do with transgender race ideology, which I was arguing, is that there is this uniformity that they will agree with what they say within a particular matter, and that's what's problem within the establishment right now, within, let's say, the business, within corporations and schools and the Democratic Party.
There's definitely uniformity among the left. Yes, they are very uniformed in that regards. They follow lockstep with whatever their party believes in, and that's to a detriment of their party because that's allowed them to be as successful, where the right has been fragmented on anything and we can't agree on anything. But that also means that they all adopt ridiculous ideologies at the same time. But again, like you were saying, even amongst during during 2020 and 2021, states were very divided about their handling of COVID based on political ideology, right? Republican states vastly opened way sooner than others. They had much less regulations compared to other left-wing states. And so that was because they just didn't fear COVID a lot. And I know for people that just would lockstep in fear of the COVID narrative because the mainstream news outlets were placing that number of like how many deaths were occurring from COVID, this hyperinflated number, to be honest.
Right.
But other individuals like myself were not sheep. We lived our lives just like normal. I don't even think I realized COVID was a thing after a few months. But years into this, there are still people who have never even recovered from the COVID fear, which is, again, you're going to put all your money on black, saying that these people are from the left and they have the left-wing ideology. Conservatives, everyone else has moved on with this years ago. And so I don't think this is only going to worsen Joe Biden, I think's chance. If he really pushes this hard, if they really spend a lot of time on this, I think it's going to hurt him mostly in the swing states where things can be really narrow. And if you start reminding people in Arizona and Pennsylvania and Georgia and Michigan and various states that Joe Biden's going to have to win, if you start reminding people about this COVID stuff, they're not going to be warm to it at all because no one wants to remember 2020 and 2021.
No, I would agree now that the fact that vaccines, what we know about what happened, the handling of the pandemic, now it will lead to more resistance. But I was saying back then. But what we're talking about with Biden right now, I think there's a lot more factors than just that would lead to him being discouraged in voting. Now, what we're talking about is how we can learn from this. It's like how we can not let government control our lives. Now, I think the fact that it easily goes through these schools, that there's low resistance is a problem. We don't. I mean, let's talk about school boards, for example. Now we're talking about whatever has to do with critical race theory or transgender ideology in school. I mean, besides you're talking about Florida again, for the most part, these states and city assemblies pass through these ideology with little resistance from people as a whole. And I know there's instances where family members have went against it, and there's been protests against these instances from families. But for the most part, we do see this compliance with this, and I think there has to be more fight against that if we want to regain a sense of American values in this country.
Right. I don't disagree with you that there is a portion of the left, right? They are the ones that will follow lockstep with the federal government because the federal government has now become their religion. It's their cult of ideology, right? Which whatever the federal government says, and this actually grew significantly during 2020 because when the federal government and the CDC were coming out with new regulations every other week, people were following lockstep with them. We said, wear your mask this week. Next week, don't wear your mask. Next week, stay 6 feet apart. Next week, we're going to open up for 3 weeks. And then everyone opened up. And then, we're going to close everything again. And those people just followed step with what the federal government was giving as their narrative, their COVID narrative, and that's because left-wing ideology, they've never the United States as a whole, basically any civilization ever has a certain doctrine that they hold dear, whether it's religion or it's politics. And now the left has seen the federal government as their king, their emperor, and so whatever they say, they think that that is like the highest possible good of any society. And so whatever the federal government says, that's what they're going to go along with. And yes, that's a huge percentage of the left. I would say that is uniquely only to the left, though.
Yeah, I mean, but let's talk about what the left is and what it represents in the ideology. It's literally a religion. Everything that goes through, well, you could call it woke, you could call it leftism. It doesn't really matter, right? Whatever goes through the federal government or its ideology, because it's this over-encompassing ideology. I wouldn't say it, because I think it's like different than a lot of ideologies, that it's not like Marxism or fascism to a certain extent, that it's not one universal thing. But the fact that, like you're saying, that they will listen to anything that the federal government says is what goes through and what everyone follows through, is kind of similar to this measure that anything that what supports the narrative of the federal government, or what we could say Democratic Party, that that people who are following that agenda will just agree with automatically, whether it has to do with COVID, whether it has to do with transgender, race ideology, whatever it is. It doesn't really matter what it is, but they will follow that like it is a religion. Like everything that they're mentioning is correct. You can't disagree with it, and that's the problem, right? That's, in my opinion, very un-American, and the question of our freedom of speech, and the question and debate meanings of different things. And that's what we lost a lot in this country over, you could say, this debate over certain issues.
Right, and I think we can talk about this forever, but I want to give us enough time to kind of talk about this new issue, because I think we're going to argue a little bit more in this next particular story, if you want to talk about this.
So in this article, it says, should there be a maximum age limit for elected politicians? So as we see what actually has been taking place recently, Senator Mitch McConnell froze up in a press conference when he was asked a question about whether he would run or not for election in 2026.
Thoughts about what?
Running for re-election in 2026.
That's
Did you hear the question, Senator? Running for re-election in 2026? All right, I'm sorry, you all. We're going to need a minute. Senator Benny.
Okay.
Somebody else have a question? Please speak up.
So, like you said, Zach, this is not the first instance where this has happened. He froze up again, probably about a month ago. It's pretty scary to actually watch this kind of occur, because he's speaking normally, and then you just see him freeze up, and you see his eyes kind of start moving back and forth. And so I don't want to make light of any of this, because it seems like there's possible health implications of why this is going on. But this is bringing up the debate on whether there should be age limits or cognitive health requirements for political officials. And I do want to make a big distinction, where we make fun of Joe Biden a lot in these instances. And that's because it's funny to make fun of someone that's old. That's just a classic joke that you can always make on somebody, and someone's old. But when someone's sick or someone has an illness, then it no longer really becomes funny to make fun of. It kind of becomes sad, and you get a little more worried. And so in instances like this, I think it's more inclined to be concerned about Mitch McConnell. But it still leaves up the question as, are these people capable of being in office?
I mean, I think the problem is that when we argue about this kind of subject, whether it has to be with Mitch McConnell and Joe Biden, that we focus as individuals or as members of political parties. I think it's actually something more important, and I'll tell you why. Because we need a capable leader. If we're electing a representative, it's important, no matter what political party, that they actually represent the interests of the people, and not for their own political interests within their party. And I think that's why it's important to bring about these cognitive tests. Now, whether it has to be only with cognitive tests, whether the process, we're going to definitely debate on that, is important, or whether we institute age limits. Now, and under those circumstances, we argue some formidable leaders like, Ronald Reagan was still cognitively there during his final term in office, whether Donald Trump seems cognitively there as of right now. So that's why I think the age prerogative wouldn't be very effective. Now, we can also argue term limits within Congress. Now, I don't know how you can define that. That would be harder to define, I would argue, instead of what's the time period when a congressman or congresswoman get out of office. I think that we can argue as well.
All right, Zach, stop beating around the bush. I'm trying to tell you, are you instilling a cognitive test? Are you instilling age requirements? What are you doing? What's your position on this?
I mean, cognitive tests for sure.
Stop being some ideologue here.
The thing about term limits, I'll tell you why. It's really hard to distinguish when you could stop term limits. I think that's the problem. But I think cognitive test, we can at least institute. I think that's important to institute. Now, I would say, and we're gonna argue over this tremendously, I would say before they run for office.
No,
if
so
you're gonna now get for office, they should take a test before and after.
Here's the problem though that I have with this, and you're not saying what you're thinking, Zach, because I know what you think and you're not saying it. We can argue about cognitive tests. We can argue about age requirements. Should that be a prerequisite to being in office? So if you're in office and you want to run for senator and say the age limit is 80 years old, I think it should be the American people's prerogative to vote for that person if they are above age. Because again, you gave some examples, like people are not, just because someone's age is older, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are mentally declined. Like Donald Trump is 78 years old. He will be one of the oldest presidents elected. And Ronald Reagan, again, was the oldest president at the time when he was elected. But they are very sharp individuals. And then there's individuals like the senator from Philadelphia, Fetterman, right? The gigantic Sasquatch, I don't know what you want to call him. He is not nearly that age, but he has significantly mental deficiencies. And those were things that you were able to see when he was running in 2022, right? 2022, when he was running. If you watched any debate between him and Dr. Oz, you could clearly see that there was mental deficiencies in his ability to speak and his ability to answer questions and his ability to be a leader. But all that being said is, if we do an implementation of this kind of caliber, I don't think it should bar someone from leaving office. Say, again, if Joe Biden had to do a mental evaluation and he failed it, that does not mean he should not be allowed to be president, because that's not the requirements to be president. There's two requirements to be president. You have to be over 35 and you have to be an American-born citizen. That's it. If the American people want to elect someone that is derelict and has no brain, that's the prerogative to elect somebody with. Do I think that's a good idea? No, that's a terrible idea. But are they allowed to do that? Just because the people voted for somebody and that person turned out not to be fit, should the federal government then have the ability to remove that person from office? I don't necessarily think so. I think it's the right of the American people to have their votes heard, even if it's a bad choice, like a Joe Biden who can't run anything, but that's what you voted for. You can't undo something that you voted for. If the American people wanted to elect a rock into president and they got the votes to do it, hey, fine by me. You got what you paid for. If you voted for that, that's what you got.
Well, okay. The thing is, yeah, the president gets elected should go into office. Now, what we're arguing here is something I think different, okay? I think the thing is, if they show, how do we trust the people? Like, okay, in a certain situation, let's say how Fetterman and Biden get elected, showing mental faculties. This has to go through what I think through kind of cognitive dissonance, right? The fact that, we know something to be untrue happens, but they will continue to support it. Like whoever, it doesn't really matter who Fetterman, what his background is, or how he speaks like. But since he's a Democrat, that's why people will vote for him. It's a brainwashing, whether it even has to do with the other side. It doesn't really matter. People shielded by political ideology, in my opinion. And I think that's the problem.
And that's the problem. Hey, if the Democrats want to vote someone who has no brain that can't further their agenda, fine by them. That's what they voted for. You can't just say later on that, okay, since this person that the people voted for, we're no longer going to see him fit to run office, so the federal government's going to remove him from office, nulling what the American people voted for. Hey, let them vote for these old people, right? Obviously, this is not a good idea, right? Because we have individuals in the Senate that are clearly unwell. Like there's this clip going around with oh man, what's her name? Zach, what's her name?
Feinstein.
Dianne Feinstein, who's like 90 years old. Yes, thank you. Where she was being asked, like, you know, they were in an election, or they were voting on some bill or whatever, and then at a time she started speaking about the bill and like trying to create an argument for it, but actually they were just voting for it, and they were just asking her to say yay across the bill, but she didn't have the mental clarity to understand that, or she didn't really know, because again, she's really old. And so we'll show that clip here.
I would like to support a yes vote on this. It provides $823 billion. That's an increase of $26 billion for the Department of Defense, and it funds priorities submitted.
Yeah, just say aye.
Okay, just aye.
So Zach Feinstein doing that, clearly there has to do something with her age and under the circumstances. Now, since she's older, now it's not every older person, but what we're talking about here is something that's not only to do with one or two politicians. We could see what's going on is that people who remain in power continuously remain in power, whether it has to do with Nancy Pelosi, whether it has to do with Dianne Feinstein, whether it has to do with Mitch McConnell, whether it has to do with Joe Biden. Doesn't matter what party, but they'll protect their own party within. It doesn't really matter. The Republican will protect their own people, and the Democrat will protect their own people. Now, if we're talking about the American people and the situation under those circumstances, what matters? Okay, why don't we have a cognitive test before they get elected to show demonstrable proof that someone has the ability or not to be a good leader?
And is that so? Who? I don't necessarily am arguing the fact that that might not necessarily be a good thing. That okay, you can have cognitive tests before their election, and maybe you have one every single year they're in office. Okay, whatever, or every subsequent time they get reelected. But I'm saying that isn't necessarily matters nearly as much, because the American people, especially when you're in an election season, you're on stage all the time. You're talking to media all the time, and just like in the Fetterman case, you could see him talking to reporters, talking in debates, and you could clearly see the fact that he was mentally unable to hold office. He had just come off from a stroke, and it was really cruel for the Democratic Party to push him in the position to run for senator. And the same thing against Joe Biden too. 77% of Americans think that he's too old to run for president. Now, it might not just be because he's too old. I think mostly that has to do with the fact that he's old and senile and can barely walk, and that those are all things encompassed in his age. But if he was a spry dude who was 85 years old that could do backflips, I don't think anyone would be talking about his age. But the fact that he's old, the American people can clearly see, and a lot of Democrats see too, 77% of the population all see that Joe Biden is way too elderly at this point to be running for president.
But Cooper, that may be true, and the stats are maybe true, but what are they doing about it? They're not doing anything about it. These are the same kind of people get elected over time. Now, it's a lot of that has to do with the donors these people get, and that's why they keep getting into office, and why probably Fetterman got into office. Now, that's just one example of it. But what are they actually doing to mitigate this? And one argument you can make is that how many people vote. Now, obviously, you shouldn't force Americans to vote. I know they do that in Australia. I would not agree with that in the United States. I don't think you should force people for civic duty to vote. But if you want to make a difference, I mean, the only way to really do it is through the voting polls. I think that's the only thing that can actually lead to change. If Americans are not doing that, if people our age who are probably least likely to do it are not doing it, then you're not going to see any change in our politicians.
That's what I'm saying. It's the prerogative of the American people to vote out the terrible candidates that they don't want to see. So in my utopia, what I would say is that, yes, this is something that we would do all the time. We would have cognitive tests. I personally would not put an age requirement on anything, because even things like the Senate in Latin from senax means old person or old man. So like these are old bodies. Being old comes with some wisdom, right? That's why we don't. I'm in favor of probably raising the voting age and putting more restrictions on people's ability to vote, because I want people to be the most educated as possible. Probably even negating even my own vote in the process. But the fact that the American people it should be their choice who they vote and who don't they vote. And so again, I would say that people do these tests, and then that gets put out to the public, and then the American people could have clear standards to see that, oh, this person is mentally incapable, they failed these tests or whatever. Do I feel comfortable voting for a person that I know doesn't have the mental clarity? But just because, say, Mitch McConnell fails a cognitive test, does he automatically get retired? I don't necessarily think that should be the case, because the American people, again, voted for him to be in office. And if they don't want to be in office, they vote him out in the next election. And I think the choice of the American people should be respected upon, rather than the whim of the federal government to just remove people who they want willy-nilly.
Okay, that's an interesting argument. Now, I want to ask you this question because we haven't really discussed that much in this episode. How about term limits? Now, the thing is, we don't have to worry about Biden getting elected after the second term. But let's say, hopefully not. Hopefully not. We'll see.
You're assuming a lot, sir. You're assuming a lot here. Yes. Do not underestimate the Republican Party on how it can lose. The Republican Party can lose in any situation ever. Okay.
If there's an FDR situation, Biden. I mean, I can't believe that. Hopefully not. Okay, but let's talk about what's the elephant in the room here, right? Why is there no term limits in Congress now? Would you support that? Now the problem is, how would you support that? What would the term limits be for senators in Congress? I think this should be talked about more as well. If let's say the cognitive test can't get passed through, how do we stop people who are in a position, who are too old, have maybe too much money? Let's say Nancy Pelosi, to be in office. How do we stop them from getting reelected?
Well, the cognitive test is probably something way more likely to get passed in a federal regulation or become an amendment than term limits are going to be, because term limits are a double-edged sword. So you have to get people that are willing enough to vote on their own destruction of their own careers, rather than banking on the fact that most people in Congress have mental efficiency, right? Everyone's going to have to abide by term limits, but not everyone in Congress are going to become as mentally incapable as a Joe Biden.
Right.
And so you're banking on different aspects of people's pride or ego here. So I would, of course, I'm in favor of political term limits, but I would say cognitive tests are way greater and way easier to actually implement in America rather than term limits, even though they probably both should be enforced or included in some regard.
I'm gonna be distinct. I'm gonna have a difference in opinion here. Okay, now I think the reason why cognitive tests are the same thing. How if they want to protect how if the party wants to protect their politician pronouncing? I mean, we could say Fetterman, right? I mean, obviously the Democrats knew his mental facilities before they run him, and they still did. Do you think that would change if there was a cognitive test? Do you think they wouldn't try to? Do you think that would not go against them? Do you think they would still want to continue that cognitive test? Because I don't think they really care. I don't think the parties really care. I mean, let's say Democrats in particular really care about who they run in these situations, as long as they get someone who supports their positions.
Well, I think they do care in a certain extent. They care about people who would win compared to the Republican parties who don't care who would win, because Republicans never elect people necessarily winnable candidates. Even Donald Trump, as much as we want to argue, you can argue about his winnability, but it's certainly not. If you're comparing just the numbers, it's even with Biden, which is not a very good sign. But even in the elections with Dr. Oz, a weak candidate, but people voted for Fetterman because, again, they voted lockstep with their party, but at the same time, the American people knew that he was incapable. They knew it, right? They can see Joe Biden falling downstairs, and every time he speaks, he starts slurring his words. It's something that the American people have recognized. But are they going to take accountability with their votes to do it? That's where we're disagreeing here, is that do the American people's right to vote, should that matter? And should we have to deal with these people? Should they have to sleep in the bed that they make? That's the argument that I'm trying to make.
Yeah, I mean, this also has to do, and we're talking about the fact that whether hopefully this would matter if we institute term limits or cognitive tests, that it would influence the American voter. But it's the fact that how polarized we're as a society, and we could just talk about the subject, but the polarization of this country is so pronounced that I don't think that's the problem. I don't think you can run certain people and get elected, even though they show the most horrendous, mental capabilities, like Fetterman, for example, right? Does that make a difference to the American voters? And I think we have to veer towards ideology and again, we have to have a change in frame within us as a society and say, go away from this who says what in situation, whether Democratic or Republican Party, and say what's best for the American people. And that's how we should vote on our elections like we used to. And I don't see that as going on with American voters nowadays.
Well, I mean, I'd agree with you that again, it's become polarized, but all I'm saying is that you got to let the American people, if they vote for a rock to become president, that rock's going to be president. If they vote for a dog to be a senator, that dog's going to be the senator, and it's got to take those 2 years, those 4 years, or however long it takes for them to re-elect that dog. And if they don't like it, then hey, the next election's coming around the corner because we're a representative republic. But Zach, I think we can argue about this all day. I think we should probably conclude while our heads are still turned straight. But I really appreciate the discussion. I think it's more fun when we're disagreeing about things and adds a little bit of fire and makes for a more interesting discussion.
Oh man, I agree with you. As the more we disagree, because I mean we agree on the most important things about truth, but the more we disagree on the factors, the more we can actually bring about that truth. And I hope every episode you guys see us talk about our interpretations of truth. Well, there's only one interpretation of truth, but our pursuit of that truth value. If you like us, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Make sure to give us a thumbs up.
See you, brother.
See you, dude.